Good morning. All right, we are on to chapter 3 for the semester, facility construction and design. Before I start, I just wanted to say I think this is one of the harder chapters. I think sometimes when we're in school, it can be difficult to truly appreciate some of the things we're teaching you and how they can be applied in the real world. I think it can be very difficult as a high school, or excuse me, as a college sophomore, as a college junior, to really appreciate what goes into facility design, unless you've been in that world, of course. For the most part, though, if you're in college, you don't know really what goes into um, looking for a building and building and all the construction elements, the legal elements, the permitting. So I think this chapter can be a little bit difficult to realize its importance, but we should be aware of its importance. All right. So let's move on to first step. First step, and we've mentioned this a little bit this semester. Um, let's say we envision a project. We want to put a sports facility somewhere. And remember, these facilities can be small, they can be big, whatever scale you want. But no matter the scale, there should be a feasibility study. At the end of the day, these things do take time and then most notably money, right? So we need to run a feasibility study to determine realistic and practical solutions. And there's several things or tools we can utilize to help determine feasibility. Some of those are a SWOT analysis, a pest analysis, or a Porter's 5. Two of these I'm going to discuss a little further on the next two slides. Um, that's the SWOT and the Porter's 5. The pest analysis I don't discuss in tremendous detail, but really for the pest analysis, you have to look at the various factors in a given area that could impact your project. So the political factors. If you want to talk about the conservatives versus liberals, the red versus the blue, and that absolutely has to be taken into account on some projects. And it goes well beyond that. The economic factors. When you imagine people, I know a local gym. They're about a 45-minute drive from me. They were originally renting, right? They were originally renting, and they decided to purchase their building. They decided to purchase their building, and I feel terrible for them. They purchased it, I want to say, about 3 months prior to the beginning of the pandemic. So I mean, obviously, you cannot forecast anything like that. No one really could have. However, imagine if they were in the middle or in the beginning of looking at um, the economic side of purchasing a building when the pandemic had already begun. So they were going to have to absolutely evaluate the situation of the pandemic and try to factor that into their analysis, the economic situation, I should say. Um, and then obviously social. We've had some social, we've had tremendous amount of social and societal changes over the last few years that absolutely affect certain businesses. I won't get into those right now, but I imagine you guys can all think of certain social influences that affect businesses and venues. If you look at the NFL right now, the NFL has faced major criticism. It's across sports, but I think the NFL, at least in my opinion, has had to deal with it the most with regards to social injustice towards women. That was a very big thing several years ago with Ray Rice and several other notable NFL players, and that affected their business model absolutely. And then most recently, if you think about it, the Brian Flores scandal. I don't know if it's a scandal, controversy, whatever you want to call it. Um, that's a social factor that is absolutely influencing their business and their business practices. And all of these things need to be accounted for.
All right, so here's an example of a SWOT. I really like a SWOT. I've personally done the SWOT several different times in my life for various projects. So SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And just apologies for this, when I copied and pasted this from Microsoft Excel, for some reason this first column, starting with costs, got highlighted in blue, which is incorrect. It should be the same color as everything else. But looking at this, we also want to recognize that the strengths and weaknesses component of the SWOT are really internal factors. The opportunities and the threats are external factors. They are external things that you can look at to either increase revenue per se, or maybe something external to you, like a competitor, which can negatively affect you. So, and usually they're also future things as well. So just to look at a few of these. So these are some things that I just typed up real quick based on when I was looking to move my place of business from one building to a larger unit. So what I ended up doing was I looked at several different units. Maybe I looked at like 8 or 9 spots, 2 or 3 of which showed promise. And what I essentially did was I did a SWOT on every single one. So like, what was some potential strengths of one unit versus another? Well, the cost could be a strength. It's just a lower monthly payment, lower fixed costs. That's a major benefit. The floor spacing of a given unit, it just happened to be perfect for my gym. Other places might have needed some walls knocked down, so the floor spacing and the floor layout were major benefits. Some weaknesses. So one facility that I was looking at the time had relatively poor lighting for parking. So when I was working with people to kind of just get their input, they suggested that it might not be the best thing if you have young kids, or if you have women trying to come either early morning. I do have 5 a.m. sessions, or if they were trying to come at night with poor lighting, some people might feel a little uncomfortable. Another potential weakness of a site that I chose was poor traffic flow. On 2 fronts. One is just there's poor visibility. That could just be a second weakness, actually, or third weakness. Traffic flow could also be, if you have a lot of people coming into your facility at a given time, if there's poor traffic flow, this can create issues. Opportunities. So again, this is a little bit more future stuff. So there was a local business which I thought could serve as a potential local partnership. Hey, it ended up being a cheerleading studio, and what we were trying to sell was, hey, you could drop your kids off at cheerleading and then come work at our gym instead of sit in your car or go home and then come back 45 minutes later. Other potential opportunities could be something like expansion, like there is space available to do an add-on or something along those lines. Threats. Again, this is something future. You could have a local competitor. Let's say you're originally 5 miles away from a competitor, but now you move. We could end up being like a mile away from a competitor, which isn't the greatest situation. And then potential threat could be a potential rent increase, depending on who your landlord is and their overall goals of what they're trying to accomplish. So that was just a quick SWOT analysis, and most of these things that I plugged into here are things that I did consider when I was moving my place of business. To add before I start going over the Porter 5 is all of those are things that you can apply when you are choosing a site to build a facility. So mine, I happen to be moving, but if you're choosing a site to build one, same thing applies. So the Porter 5, it's a little unique, and they talk about potential forces that could be good or bad, right? So the first force of the Porter 5 is supplier power. If you are reliant on a very specific product or construction supply, right? Do the suppliers have a tremendous amount of power? If there are many suppliers, you have many options to choose from. There should be a low supplier power. And conversely, there's buyer power. Can buyers manipulate prices? The fewer buyers there are, the more ability you have to dictate the terms of your business, because people want your business if there's fewer buyers. What about competitive rivalry? If you're trying to locate a business, and I talked about this on the SWOT, if you're trying to find a location for a business, what does the competition look like in the area, right? I've talked a bit very loosely about moving my facility to be more of a true sporting venue instead of a gym. And we talked about like what's our competition. Well, very most recently, the town has built a new sporting facility about 1 mile down the road. Could they be a potential rivalry to our future business? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Threat of substitution. This really just depends on your product. If you are, let's say, building a facility to house a professional sports team, the possibility of a threat of substitution is definitely going to be lower than if you're delivering a product like, let's say, like a CrossFit. A CrossFit, they ended up popping up almost everywhere. This was a major thing. I know this happened to several different CrossFits where a CrossFit, they opened up their CrossFit. They were in business for several years. As they grew, they hired trainers. And then at some point, sometimes the trainers might think, why am I doing this for a fraction of the price or a fraction of the pay when I can go out and start my own CrossFit? So the threat of substitution with regards to a CrossFit and the new entry, the barrier to entry was relatively low. So you saw that a lot, right, in the CrossFit world. Right, so that's an example of some of the Porter 5 forces. Estimating costs and budgeting. And like I said, I think this can be difficult if you haven't been in this world, but this is incredibly, incredibly important, right? You have to prepare a budget for proposed projects. And this is really what determines the feasibility. If a product is going to be too costly, you cannot do it. Right? I mean, we do these numbers in our head. If any of you are entrepreneurs in any regard, you think, oh, can I afford this? Right? And you too, probably very simple budgeting in your head, but you're doing it, right? So the three things that we really need to know here is what's a pro forma. A pro forma is something that summarizes the projected status of a company or project that enables us for sound financial planning, right? Some things you might see on a pro forma are fixed costs and variable costs. So fixed costs are just that, things that don't really change significantly month to month or year to year. And the most notable cost of a fixed cost is monthly rent or mortgage payments if you were to buy the facility. The variable costs, which can depend on the scale or size of your business and can change significantly month to month, might be something like labor or supplies. So, for example, my training facility, as we have, when I first opened, I was the only trainer here. I got a little help my first few years, but as I've expanded, I've also become a full-time teacher. I've had to hire several other trainers. I think I have 4 now in total. And my labor costs have gone up significantly compared to where I was 7, 8 years ago when we first opened. So when you're putting together a pro forma for a facility that you are looking to build or land that you are looking to purchase, all right, you have to estimate the construction costs, right? Your text breaks it down into 2 different areas, hard costs versus soft costs. So hard costs are things that are directly related, elements that are directly related to your project. So most notably is construction supplies, construction labor, all of those things. The other would be soft costs, which are indirectly related to the construction of your project. So something most notable here, again, directly or indirectly related to construction, legal fees and permits are indirectly related or considered indirectly related to the cost of a project. So those would be considered a soft cost. So just some things that you might want to break down into direct and indirect would be the land. Obviously, how much does the land cost? What about the facility design? When you have to hire a team to draw up a schematic for the facility, engineer, utilities, materials, labor, right? So all of these things that must be identified early on in this process before we greenlight a project. So site selection. Site selection will contribute to the attraction of future patrons to the facility. One thing you have to also keep in mind is, what about your future growth? You cannot just choose a location based on your current business. Every business should really have a 5 and 10-year plan. And where do you project to be? What fits your current amount of customers or clients currently should not be what will fit them 5 or 10 years down the road. So you need to make sure your facility has the ability to expand. So you have to have a dedicated site search for land and location that has the potential to produce anticipated revenues. We need to have a sound design plan and schematics. And lastly, site factors such as multiple entry and exit points, traffic lights, dedicated turn lanes, all of these things need to be factored in. Right? So again, if you're a relatively small facility, some of this might not be as vital to your success, but some a little bit more so. If you are a major facility that will be attracting tens of thousands of spectators, something like traffic lights and turning lanes, these are things that must come into consideration. If we talk about multiple entry and exit points, there is a local cheerleading studio directly up the road from me, and they came into some issues, a decent amount of issues, because they were very their clients are condensed around a very given time period, usually between the hours of 4 and 8 p.m. They don't really have much business going on during the day between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. So what would happen is it was really just a one-lane road, and they might get 40, 50 cars, between 4 and 6 p.m. and this one-lane road became a major issue. And sure enough, they had to expand the road to be 2 lanes, and these things can be costly. So this is one of the major things, as I was trying to prepare this chapter for you guys on, we don't really think about this when we're in college. I don't even think about this on a regular basis because it's nothing that I deal with regularly. But when you are looking for land or a specific site, 2 things that should be looked at before purchasing or before construction are topographical and geographical reports. So topographical displays key elements that make up the site, like electric, sewer, water, and gas. These are things that must be running to your site for your facility to operate. And while it seems intuitive that, hey, they should have them, they don't always. Next thing is a geographical report, and I know a little bit about these. This really indicates the soil conditions that dictates what minerals are necessary to support the foundation. I only know about this because of our local track facilities, and we're actually getting a new track. Some tracks, especially built in the 80s and 90s, they were built on surfaces that were not ideal for water runoff, and accordingly, they had a high flooding rate. So a local track at Pearl River High School, I think it was having major issues with flooding because they didn't really have they probably, I don't know, have a great geographical report. So once we've finished selecting our site, this begins the design process. And I should also say that several of these steps do not just happen in sequence. They can be happening simultaneously. So we can possibly be doing a feasibility study or some type of feasibility study while still looking at various sites and gathering information for site selection. Likewise, during the site selection process, we could be interviewing various design firms. But hopefully, once we've done everything else and we've defined our components for the site schematics, we have a framework to establish the design elements, and we could really begin that. When I say we, this is mostly done and should be done with the help of a design firm. Obviously, this depends on the size of the facility, but a design firm is incredibly important because there's many elements to building a facility that for the most part, most of us are just not aware of. So when you are finally hiring a design firm, and you should be interviewing several, these are some things within the contract that should be included. And the most notable of these are costs, right? So if you look at design costs for the schematic, costs for engineers, surveys, costs for landscape design, And then in addition to that, we're looking for a few other things like mechanical, plumbing, electrical, and fire protection drawings, issuing proper permits, all of these things. And then the most important probably is how do they plan on closing out the project, right? How do you plan on closing this out and getting the construction underway? Once again, these need to be flexible, and they could be happening simultaneously while other projects or phases are happening. The first part of this is really just putting together a set of drawings or schematics. And we want to this is really based on the function of the building. We want to make sure that they illustrate the proposed components of the layout that we've initially defined earlier. And we want to just make sure we designate required spaces that are up to code. And this is why you have to have a design firm, because we don't know these things like standard codes, and they vary from municipality to municipality. Usually what happens is you'll get several different drawings. The architect and the engineer, usually they should be in-house in the same firm. They work together, they make edits, they'll make edits based on your input as well, and then they'll finalize drawings. There will be several, sometimes many different revisions during this process, but we want to make sure at the end that they are in compliance with all local codes. As we are kind of wrapping this up, I think the most important thing is understanding how long this can take. We have to understand that this process alone, with permits and drawings, and like I said, there can be many different revisions, this can take up to 8 to 12 months depending on the size of the project, right? So at this point, you should start to gain appreciation for the timeline. You do a feasibility study. That could be a month, 2 months, 3 months. After doing a feasibility study, you start looking at various sites. Then you will hire a firm. We're talking about 18 months, possibly, again, depending on the size, before we've even begun construction, right? So this can be an incredibly time-consuming process. Construction cannot commence without permits, which can lead to work stoppages and delays. Sometimes we get mid-project, inspector comes in and realize a certain permit has not been issued for a given part of the project, and this can lead to stoppage and delays. And what we know about stoppages and delays, this costs money. But like I've said repeatedly, permits can vary from municipality to municipality. On to the construction process. So at this point, we should be finally breaking ground. Before we even break ground, we have to interview contractors. And like I said, many of these things are not in pure sequential order. They do overlap a little bit. So you should have been interviewing contractors during the design process, those 8 to 12 months that I outlined. Just like interviewing many different design firms, you should be interviewing many different contractors. When you're interviewing contractors, they're going to outline the cost of a lot of the materials. So you want to be, discuss these costs with them, right? So you got to consider your cost savings over your time savings. So time versus so things that are going to cost you more money now might be more suitable than things that will cost you less money in the long run. So, I have an example of the mats I've chosen to use at my gym, right? So gym flooring is incredibly expensive. It was the biggest expenditure of new pieces of equipment when I moved into a larger facility. And I ended up going with a relatively cheaper flooring that was not professionally installed. And what I've had to do is, because it wasn't professionally installed, I have to fix the mats of my gym floor every 6 months, give or take. I've had these mats for over 4 years, so you figure that's 8 times that I've had to gather a team of people to help move these mats. It takes maybe an hour and a half each time, so that's about 12 hours over the last 4 years. That's time for me, time for other people, but in addition, it has cost me money. So would it have been better for me to shell out a few extra dollars at the time to have them professionally installed with a different material? It might have been. And I can tell you right now, I am going to be getting professional grade mats, just because if you average this out over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, yes, it's going to cost me money in the long run. Like I said, you have to interview many contractors, and when you're interviewing them, don't be afraid to dig into their references. All right, last slide. Insurance. Owners, contractors, and designers all should carry their own insurance to make sure you're protecting yourselves. So we all really need insurance. If I'm referring to we, you as the owner. Liability insurance protects against failure of the architecture and engineering of the building. So what happens is design companies need to make sure that they have a very specific type of insurance called errors and omissions insurance. And if perhaps during, before, or even after, down the road, this could be 5-10 years down the road, there's some type of failure in the structure of the building, with the errors and omissions insurance, if taken out correctly, the designers are not at fault or liable. So that is a big one. The contractors should have liability insurance. So if, for instance, a worker gets injured on site, they should be insured through them. And I would also say the last one is to cover the owner. That's a builder's risk insurance. So you have to, as soon as you purchase a given site, you have to take out builder's insurance. And this covers you just in case, like the things listed, someone steals materials, if there's a major fire, or even something like an act of God, damages all of the materials on site. So you're covered in that sense. So I could just tell you guys firsthand, make sure you are covered in every way possible. It'll help allow you to sleep better at night. That's it for chapter 3.